Hello, we're here with Ben Johnson, CTO and founder of Obsidian Security. Nice to have you with us. How are you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on here.
It's a funny world we're finding ourselves in, and it's great that we get an opportunity to do more interviews like this. Your latest offering really focuses on SaaS security. But throughout this conversation, I want to look at what that means in today's disparate working environment. But first of all, first principles, you do a lot with cloud detection and response. It's kind of one of your sweet spots. What is that all about?
Yeah, so if we step back a little bit, and again, thanks for, excuse me, thanks for having me on here. I think the world started with network, and maybe this is basic for a lot of the viewers, but the world started with, hey, I'm going to monitor traffic on my network. And then they said, well, you got to kind of push the defenses closer to the humans because they're going to move. They're going to go to coffee shops. They're going to go to conferences. And so endpoint got really hot, right? It exploded. And that was my previous world was endpoint detection and response, looking at what's going on in your computers. And then what we did here at Obsidian now is we said, well, the world is really moving to cloud or already using cloud, sort of mix of both. Cloud first strategy is what we hear a lot. And therefore, your users are accessing these essentially cloud-based applications or services, essentially a lot of SaaS. There's also some infrastructure as a service too. And they're using it to store, business plans and share sensitive information, company documents, et cetera. And that's great. And you really need to take a sort of three-pronged approach of you need to try to harden it as much as you can in terms of making sure default settings are set to the most sort of beneficial to reducing risk and that kind of thing, multi-factor authentication, all that stuff. Trying to get it so more by default day-to-day use is less risky. But then you need to analyze what's going on in these systems to see, hey, does this look like a adversary is actually in these accounts, or is someone on the inside doing something they shouldn't, either on purpose or accidentally? And then in either of those situations, can you do some investigation, right? And the challenge is it's all stored on someone else's infrastructure, right? It's their application or service, it's their logs, it's their kind of everything. It's just your client is connecting in and sending data, retrieving data, getting emails, whatever. And so we said, look, this is a gap that hasn't really been solved, where it's a purpose-built tool or purpose-built capability for the SOC, for the security team, the incident response team, where you have to pull together these disparate log sources that are completely different and try to have a more complete picture of what's going on so you can detect threats and respond to them. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, trying to figure out where there might be some bad activity, and then can you investigate it and try to prove it's bad or resolve it, and then kind of business as usual again.
So kind of like EDR, but for the cloud.
And that's why we've essentially called it CDR to play off of EDR.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so I guess in this brave new world, it may last a month, it may last longer. We might find ourselves relying on SaaS in not just from a business perspective, because that's very, very usual, but all throughout the consumer world, all sorts of new SaaS. I know you're a big advocate of SaaS hardening, but how can we actually harden SaaS applications anyway?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think there's a lot. There's a lot of different applications, and some might be much easier to do, some might be much harder, some you can probably not do as much because the data or the risk is much lower, whereas others it's absolutely critical and you have to do whatever you can to reduce risk. And then I think there's a few challenges that we see, right? And the first is a lot of times the security team or the person that's really trying to manage and mitigate risk is often disconnected from the business unit or the application owner or whoever it is that really manages, Office 365 or Salesforce or Workday, or kind of pick your business application. So I think just bringing these teams together and making sure they both have some awareness and some say, some access maybe. I think that's the first part. The second part is really understanding what you're trying to defend against, right?
Mm.
And so, are you defending against the external adversary coming in? Well, if you get single sign-on and multi-factor authentication and some of that stuff, that starts to reduce that risk. It's not gone. There's still plenty of that risk, but it's much reduced, right? I mean, I think everyone understands the benefits of like multi-factor authentication and that kind of thing. But then it's like, okay, are you worried that there's an insider threat that is, maybe you're a high intellectual property type company and you're worried someone's going to take your formula or your upcoming news about a business merger and do insider trading on that or whatever. I'm not trying to scare people,
Yeah.
but these are realities. Like you have to be concerned with some of these scenarios. Or is it, maybe you're just worried that someone's going to accidentally leak this huge, customer list or customer, PII or whatever. Regardless, you think about like, what are you concerned about and what's kind of the big areas of risk. And then you have to look at, what are your controls? What are your applications? Now in SaaS, especially with users often just connect directly to it from their, could be a company device, could be their own phone, whatever. You essentially have to look to what can I do in the application itself to harden it, right? So there's the whole continuous monitoring, threat detection stuff we can talk about. But to harden, it's really like, are there built-in settings or, that like, can I really make sure that there's more control over who gets granted access and those kinds of things. So I think there's sort of access and account hygiene, like do the right people have access, or just contractors thrown like new accounts at will and there's no real process, or is it like more controlled of who's getting access to these things, who's becoming the privileged users, and then, are there different settings, configuration options, et cetera, where you can say, for example, every time you share a file, it has to have a expiration date where the shared link just expires, or every Zoom meeting has to have a password.
Oh yeah.
Like there's some of those things where if you just tweak maybe the defaults are almost always easy, right? It's like open, everything lasts forever, like your accounts last forever, right? If we shift that a little bit and say, look, the default future state is going to have a half-life, it's going to expire, or by default the person's going to be sort of shoved into doing things a more secure way, hopefully still as productive. So anyways, there's just different settings and different sort of policies and things like that usually you can look at in these different services, and then that kind of maps back to my earlier point about like, what are you concerned about? Is it external, inside, everything, some other third-party risk, etc. So yeah.
Would any of the big providers let you look under the hood, or would this strictly relate to hardening the controls?
It's usually, from my experience, it's usually that the sort of top level of, you can look at the application controls they've explicitly revealed or allow you to have some control over, some manipulation of. I'm guessing if you're a really large organization, you can probably throw your weight around and get maybe an inside look into the underlying infrastructure and
Mm.
cloud and things like that. However, I think that's probably extremely rare, because I mean they're trying to manage that and make sure you don't have to worry about like what's underneath Office
Yeah.
365 or
Yeah.
Box or whatever. So I don't personally know if you can do that. I think if you're really a big customer of theirs, you can probably have some pretty intense discussions there. But for the most part, it's what they reveal.
Yeah, and for the most part, most businesses, they won't really need to. They just need to ensure they've got the right settings, like the Zoom password you mentioned, that made the news, and people had not implemented it. Um, so, but now we're all working remotely, which I think is quite a good thing. It's quite good for the lack of commuting and so on. How are we going to collaborate more securely now?
Yeah, I think I think that is one of the challenges, because you're essentially granting access to different systems or sharing files, and at least in the immediate climate, with people that you're probably not going to see. Or I was just having a conversation with a CISO, and he said two interesting things. The first was he's hiring people that no one on the team has ever physically met. Now they're doing video calls and stuff like that. It's not just like a random name.
Mm.
They've seen this person and communicated, but and then they're just mailing them a company laptop and giving them access to some accounts And so there is a bunch of sort of trust you're just granting. And so that's one area. The second is, some of these companies have overseas environments, overseas, support centers, call centers and things like that, in places where, maybe the security hygiene is not as good. And so what they typically do is require all the employees to work at a more secure, company location. Like it's the company laptops, nothing leaves, nothing comes in. It's just trying to get maybe sort of the US level of hygiene and due diligence, which isn't perfect, but is maybe better than some of these other countries where maybe their call centers are and stuff. That's kind of gone out the window, and now all these kind of remote workers are working from their kitchen desks, kitchen counters and kitchen tables and things like that. And so, it has changed the threat model and the way people work. I think in general, most companies were moving already to more collaborative tools and file sharing and online access and shared customer databases and things like that. It's just now that there's really no control where you can say, look, everything has to be done from HQ and it has to do this and that. So that's one thing. I think on the positive side, one of the hardest things that we've observed from organizations is we have created this, we as like the globe or as like knowledge workers have, the organizations have established themselves as being dynamic, where your team is traveling and your CEO or your executives could be in any state or multiple countries in the same week or whatever. And so if you're trying to do like monitoring and trying to figure out like, wait, this file was just accessed from Dubai and then it was just accessed from Singapore and now it's San Francisco all in like a 2-day span, it's like, well, actually maybe your CEO did that crazy journey, right? And so the positive is, if we're not traveling as much, you can start to predict sort of behavior or where people should be connecting into these shared files or to Salesforce, to these other tools. That should be a little bit more predictable. So not that any of us want what's going on, but there are some areas where it's like, okay, maybe it is actually creating a little bit more stability, because you don't really have these road warriors that are connecting from all these different Starbucks and Wi-Fi hotspots and different countries in the same week, and things that just make it harder to identify, like, is this supposed to be happening or not.
I guess that's a good plus point in a way, especially if you're a CISO and wondering where all these VPN tunnels are coming in from. No, that's very interesting. Well, on an insider threat level, then it must make it pretty easy, seeing as the endpoint and who is at the endpoint roughly. Has all this made it easier or harder to detect insider threat?
So insider threat is incredibly tricky, because I think you essentially have true insider threat, which is like the malicious insider. Then you have the accidental sort of insider threat. Um, Starting on the accidental side, I do think companies continue to get better. I think they have a long way to go, but they continue to get better about quick detection, or like the earlier points, setting up policies where by default your Amazon S3 bucket is not public. I mean, there was like a year or two where it seemed like everyone was just making everything public, but they didn't mean to. And so I think teams have gotten a little bit better at looking at that. And I think, I heard the quote the other day, like, I don't want SaaS to be the next, S3 bucket, public S3 bucket. But getting to a better place where you just sort of make it a little harder for the mistakes to really hurt you, right? I think that's a great movement. We're not done. We have a lot of work to do there, but at least people are trying to solve that problem. On the malicious insider, I think it's actually a little tricky, because people are creating so much data and setting up so many different systems, and it is pretty hard to track who should be accessing files and who shouldn't, right? And we try to do a lot of this ourselves, but just in general, like in a more sort of theoretical sense, if someone every day accesses one file, or let's make it simple, like one file, and then all of a sudden accesses hundreds of files owned by all sorts of other people, by executives, whatever, okay, that's pretty obvious something is different. Maybe it's not criminal, or maybe it's not worthy of termination. Like maybe there's a legitimate purpose, but that huge spike or that huge deviation should be rare enough that, okay, I want to be notified every time that that happens and go investigate. Um, the reality is it's usually not that black or white. It's more like, hey, this person increased their level of account access or documents, or sort of trickled things out and stuff like that. So I think that's the challenge that will continue to be a challenge in cybersecurity, is how do you detect the person that's a little bit more deliberately just getting one file each day from a different person that accidentally shared it with them or whatever. I think the other thing is that makes this harder is a lot of these tools, because of my first point around accidental sharing, we say, okay, we're going to get rid of public sharing by default, but by default, maybe it's shared with your whole domain. Okay, cool. So by default, when someone shares a file, it's not going out to the rest of the world, but it's still going to the 5,000 people in your company.
Mm.
And maybe they have to search for it. Maybe it doesn't, tell them that they have access to this. But I think there are some situations still where if you want access to a lot of files, you can get it. And so then the question is, how do you look at patterns, who owns the file, who's the user, who's their manager, who are their peers? So you have to kind of do all this crazy analysis of like where person sees, all this like sort of graph theory of what they're connecting to doesn't match their profile. And so I think you'll see a lot of investment there over the next few years, especially with these collaboration tools.
Definitely. No, well, that's fascinating, and it is a brave new world. So what's next for you? What are you working on next?
Yeah, I mean, just trying to continue to move our business forward, and work with more and more organizations. I think companies are, um, they're realizing that these SaaS apps do have a lot of critical data, and like, yeah, you protect some endpoints, and that's great. We saw an explosion of EDR and endpoint markets and that kind of thing, but um, you know, the adversary just gets into your Office 365 account and never hits an endpoint, or someone accidentally gets password compromised to Salesforce, and someone logs in and sees all of your sort of sales data leading up to your maybe stock market quarterly
Yeah,
numbers. I mean, we see that, and
visual hacking.
yeah, and so we're seeing a lot of incident response firms start to really get calls about like SaaS compromise and things like that. Us personally, we're real excited because we're coming out with Zoom monitoring.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so as you mentioned, I think earlier, like everyone's using Zoom or similar tools, and that's great. But you know how many people have access now to Zoom accounts in your company, and where are people connecting in from, and who's recording the meetings, and where who has admin rights to your Zoom accounts and could potentially quickly add licenses or whatever, right? I mean, there's lots of different concerns. So, I think we're trying to figure out where we can help most as a business, but I think in general, just trying to help with awareness, and there are ways that companies can help defend themselves with built-in capabilities. We would love everyone to give us a try, but I think regardless, the security guy in me says just go try to harden a little bit at least. I mean, hopefully a lot, but let's just say at least do a little bit of hardening in your email, your file sharing, your other collaboration tools, your video conferencing tools, and then if you can do some monitoring, if you can pull some logs together and look for at least just like weird countries connecting in that you have no expectation, you have no
Mm.
one in this random country or whatever. Um, I think just trying to help the industry. I think be aware of some of this stuff is a huge part of what we're trying to do as well. So yeah, and then just like everyone else, just figure out the whole 24/7 sitting at home working and doing home life stuff. And the joke I make is we're 3-year-old startup now, and I'm finally, like, I'm in the garage now. You're supposed to be in the garage before the startup really takes off, and now we sort of took off, and now we're back in the garage. So it's pretty interesting time.
No, that's a great metaphor. I like it. Hopefully it lets us all reset and build more things. But yes, Ben, thanks for being on, and yeah, have a great Easter.
Thanks, you too. Really appreciate the invite.